Over the past 30 years, China's rapid economic development has catapulted it to the forefront of world politics, becoming a major player to rival the United States. But recent controversy over Taiwan and the Uygher people has raised a spotlight on the communist country and led to a backlash from many Western nations. Talking to politicians and experts, we've put together a foreign policy discussion on China. How dangerous do you think the situation is becoming between Taiwan and China?
The situation between China and Taiwan is getting more dangerous because of the way how the Chinese government is upping the ante. It is very clear under Xi Jinping that he will try to get Taiwan before he hands over power. The saving grace is that he's about to make himself leader for life, and he's only 68. So he is not in a desperate hurry to get this done in the next few years.
Yeah, I think I'm probably more pessimistic about the future when it comes to Taiwan than I've ever been. And I was in Hong Kong and China in 1995-96 during the missile crisis way back then. And that's because then nobody really thought that this was an agenda for war. It was an agenda about stopping Taiwan pushing for independence, and reverting to the status quo was a decent option. And what I get concerned about now is that in the long run, I don't think the status quo is acceptable to Xi Jinping.
Are you worried about how that relationship is heating up, that rivalry is heating up?
Obviously, the last thing we want is some sort of military conflict between the United States and China. And it's important we get more light and less heat. I mean, I think we should agree to trade together, but ultimately it is important, I suppose, that the United States is showing that it will support freedom.
On the American side, there is a view that the United States had previously been too relaxed in helping China to modernize and to rise, and with a hope that China would be a bit more like Western democracies as it become richer and build up its middle classes. That didn't happen, and sees China now as a near peer competitor, moving increasingly to become a peer competitor, and potentially could even challenge and overtake American power. So there is this basic change in the US side. And on the Chinese side, there was a change from previously seeing the United States as a not quite role model, but a friendly competitor that was willing to help China to do a lot of things, even though ultimately there are competitions there, to basically seeing that China has now got the capacities to compete against the United States and outcompete the United States. And why should we not therefore claim our spot under the sun?
What do you make of their commitment to climate change?
Obviously, the Chinese have done a lot in terms of being the biggest producers of solar power, for instance. But the truth is that 28% of the global emissions are now created by China, which is more than the EU and the United States combined. 6% of the global GDP is spent on fossil fuel subsidies. And China actually has more fossil fuel subsidies than the United States, the EU and Russia combined. And they won't peak in terms of emissions until 2030. We don't know what that peak is. And we're going to breach the Paris 1.5 degree threshold probably by 2025 at the rate we're going, because we're producing 60% more emissions than 1990. So what we need to do is to basically move forward with carbon border taxes, as the EU is suggesting, so we don't have a situation where clean steel from South Wales, where I am, for instance, is substituted for dirty steel with twice the carbon from China.
Well, this is a big issue at home, right? It's a big domestic issue for China, and that's why the Chinese leadership are committed to doing something. Environmental issues have been the cause of a number of demonstrations and protests. When the smog hit Beijing, I was there in the air apocalypse, and you really couldn't see across the road. And in some respects, the the best thing that happened was that it happened in Beijing, because it'd been happening in other Chinese cities for years and years and years. But when it takes place in the capital, in front of the political leaders, they do something more about it.
Do you think that they are worried about the kind of international image?
Well, first of all, the Chinese government does care a lot about its international image. And that's why Xi Jinping has a very clear directive to everybody in China that they must go out and, in his words, tell China's story well.
If you want to know what the Chinese government is concerned about in terms of its international image, then all you need to do is go and look at the white papers that it produces, because the white papers that are produced and published in English by the Information Office at the State Council tend to be explaining why Westerners are wrong in being critical of China and in specific issue areas. The one came out recently on Chinese democracy and why it was a good and effective democracy. And there have been a number of white papers over the last 3 or 4 years on different elements of Chinese Communist Party control in Xinjiang and freedom of people in Xinjiang, and that gives you an indication.
As far as Xi Jinping is concerned, he is doing all the great things for the Uygher people, and if the Uygher people don't understand that the Uygher people got a problem, Xi Jinping doesn't got a problem. And if the rest of the world thinks that there's a problem, they got a problem, not him.
I think we need to make clear that we're not happy with clearly human rights abuses, and there are those people, of course, in the West who say, oh, you've got to separate out the interests of trade and the interests of human rights. But ultimately, we shouldn't be sort of feeding a regime that's growing in power that may in future threaten us, who clearly don't value the very values that were built upon. And so there is an interaction. And I think insofar as the Chinese authorities realize that, we genuinely care about this, and we'll put our money where our mouth is in trade ultimately, which we're not at the moment with, Beijing boycotts and Magnitsky stuff, they will perhaps take it seriously. But they won't understand anything but, taking action as opposed to talking.